In Basis 11, we re-release an early interview with Nick Pope, only days after he left the MOD in 2006. With a tight turnaround of only 60 minutes to spare, Nick makes some vitally important statements in this interview, some we feel with his caution down due to pressure of time. So the researcher should pay very careful attention to what he says and how he says it. Some sections have been included for Basis 3.
Well, Nick, were you pushed or did you leave voluntarily the Ministry of Defence? Was it a happy occasion?
Oh, I left entirely of my own volition, yes.
So let's just get that that sort of clear. It's sort of, you're now a free agent, but you obviously can't speak of certain things which you're still bound by the Official Secrets Act.
Yes, I'm bound by the Official Secrets Act. In fact, of course, as you know, that's binding for life, so the fact that I've left the MOD is actually irrelevant. Having said that, inevitably, as one sees with retired generals speaking out on military issues, there is a certain degree more freedom, and one does inevitably speak out a little bit more freely on issues.
You don't have an immediate boss who's going to haul you up and give you a good carpet.
Exactly. I think you'd have to be accused under the Official Secrets Act for a case to be brought. The threshold would have to be fairly high, and I think you're unlikely to reach that threshold, and I certainly have no intention of doing so.
So what cases were you able to deal with when you were in your position in the MOD? What cases are the ones which stand out in your mind?
Well, I think inevitably the Rendlesham Forest incident is a big one. Now, I wasn't there at the time, of course, that was December 1980, but what I was able to do was to access the file and, frankly, wonder why a little bit more hadn't been done at the time. So I decided that there was enough to, as it were, reopen the investigation. Firstly, to draw together all the documents to see what we had. And secondly, to check out some of the things to do with physical trace evidence. Now, I mean, the key thing, of course, were the radiation readings recorded in Colonel Holt's original report to the MOD. Now, because we had that data, I could then go to the Defence Radiological Protection Service and say to them, right, this is what we've got, this is the location, please do an assessment. And their assessment was that it was higher than background levels by a factor of somewhere between 8 and 10. Now,
when did they do that analysis?
They did that, I think it was 1993.
So a long time after the event.
Oh yeah, long time afterwards. Now, what they were doing, of course, is they didn't make a site visit. This was going to be the next step. I wanted, of course, a site visit. There were a number of problems with that. Firstly, of course, the landing site wasn't on MOD land, it was on Forestry Commission land, so inevitably it would have made a few waves. Secondly, nobody actually could be sure where the landing site was. Firstly, because there was conflicting evidence. Secondly, because the Great Storm of 1987 had absolutely flattened large parts of Rendlesham Forest. And of course all the recognisable landmarks and things, even to the witnesses, when you take them there to this day, they can't even agree where the landing site was. So those were the problems. A massive missed opportunity. Rendlesham, in many ways, was a fundamentally flawed investigation.
By the United States?
Well, now that's one of the problems, of course. One of the great difficulties is that we had a twin-track investigation. Now, any police officer will tell you that when you're doing an inquiry, and I increasingly draw comparisons between police investigations and UFO investigations, because actually the methodology is broadly similar.
Or should be.
Should be, yes. I mean, I've worked with a lot of police, both civil and military, and of course it's one of those great truisms that the way in which you investigate, say, a murder is going to be broadly the same as you investigate a small theft. You would identify and recover evidence, you would identify and interview witnesses, and he would identify and interview a suspect. Now those three central tenets, actually, apart from the suspect, apply to ufology, or should apply, yeah.
So the point is, it seems that the British side of things were sort of jacked into what was going on because of American evidence in the early stages, and of course we have the history is there, but it seems that the way the base behaved at the time implied that they knew what that object was, and they were forewarned and were able to prepare to receive that object. That would suggest that they had some kind of communication with it. Do you have any evidence, or have you discovered any evidence which implies that that was a man-made object?
No, I don't, and I'm not sure I actually agree with the premise that this was expected. I mean, I think if I can just go back and elaborate on this point about why things went wrong, what we had was the Ministry of Defence conducting an investigation into some aspects of the case, and the United States Air Force having a look at other aspects, and you've got to have, in any inquiry, one person in charge. Everyone's got to be clear who's leading the investigation, and the person leading the investigation has to be clear that everyone else knows exactly what they're required to do and by when. Now, this didn't happen. So, for example, what one finds is the Defence Intelligence Staff, in fact, in this case, DI-52, carried out the initial assessment of the radiation readings, and as I was able to confirm in later years, said, yes, they are significantly higher than background. This was not briefed back to the United States Air Force. Conversely, the United States Air Force were taking witness statements from Peniston, Burroughs, Kavanasak, Buran, and these witness statements were not passed to the Ministry of Defence. So you had two investigations, each investigation having important pieces of the puzzle which weren't then shared with the other.
The implication from some data implies that there was some kind of temporal ship involved, some kind of hyperdimensional, shall we call it, Philadelphia experiment style technology vehicle involved. From some of the witnesses who've declared certain things, is there any data on that from on the British side?
There's nothing in the Ministry of Defence file on that, but I know, and I certainly take the point that witnesses, particularly Jim Peniston, who of course actually got close enough to touch the side of the thing on the first night, that Jim Peniston, yes, feels that this thing might have been a craft from the future as opposed to any sort of extraterrestrial vehicle. All I can say is that I obviously can't rule that out.
Okay, moving on, I was very impressed by the fact that in the 1993 case that was recently on television, the usual suspects, as we would describe them in ufology, were tending to sort of play it down, sort of push it aside, but you were very keen to say that it was a UFO. Could you expand on that?
Yes, the 1993, the March 1993 sightings were an important turning point for me personally, I think, in my belief about UFOs.
That was the thing that actually switched it?
It was one of the things. I think the other thing was access to the formerly classified files and delving back into, of course, files that have been classified secret UK eyes only and such like,
what
dating back to the 50s.
What makes them not classified? What qualifies a particular file or case in that regard to suddenly become available to other eyes?
The Freedom of Information Act. The MOD has to follow the letter of the law, so any application for UFO documents or files has to be considered against the criteria in the Freedom of Information Act. Now, of course, there are exemptions for defence, for national security. Yeah, and what you would do, the presumption is that you release. That's the interesting point. So it's a mind shift, as it were, from previously when the presumption was not to release. So your start point is, I'm going to have to release this. Then what you do is you look at the exemptions under the Act and you see if any of them apply. And if they do, you don't release, or you only partially release. If those exemptions don't apply, then you release.
What actually made the ministry actually even have somebody like yourself even talking in the first place?
Well, there's always been a skeptic versus believer debate on the UFO issue at the Ministry of Defence, in the Air Force, in the intelligence community, as much as anywhere else. Now, I think I'm only one in a number of so-called believers to have been involved in this subject over the years. I mean, of course, some of the great post-war figures like Earl Mountbatten, Lord Dowding, Sir Peter Horsley, Ralph Noyes, a former head of the section where UFO investigations are done. There are many people before me who believed, who spoke out on this issue. So I'm not. I think it's fallacious to portray me as some sort of whistleblower who's just come out for the first time.
That was interesting. I think from the point of view of the camera that I've had technical vision disturbance once we immediately started talking. So I noticed these things.
Okay.
And just when I've mentioned it, this has happened again. I've had technical vision disturbance. Vision disturbance. Vision disturbance. One of the things which, on basis 2, I was discussing with the United States individual who worked in one of the facilities in America, and he was able to describe how individuals within a given department who are going to deal with ETs were trained up. They'd be the best in their field, in whatever field that they were required in, but only a small minority of them would actually be able to deal with an ET as such. Is there anything in the Ministry of Defence files or any other files which does allude to any actual contact with ETs in underground facilities in this country?
There's nothing in the MOD files that I've seen that indicates any contact with extraterrestrial entities,
or shall we say non-human entities,
or indeed non-human
I think it's maybe
entities.
important not to necessarily suppose that they are all have to be extraterrestrial.
No, there's nothing in the files on that. But I think just again to perhaps give you an idea of the way in which the UFO project works. It worked with me almost. I'm going to use the analogy of the spider in the centre of the web, but and I'm sure my critics will have something to say about that.
Yeah.
But effectively, I was running the project, and there was, as it were, a loose network of experts who I could draw upon, whose expertise, whose equipment, whose time I could draw upon on an as and when basis. So what would happen is that I would get a UFO report, I would begin my investigation, and then, for example, I would bring in, as needs be, radar specialists, say from the RAF Air Defence sections in main building. I would bring in Royal Air Force Fylingdales, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning Centre, the Space Tracking Radar. I would bring in that particular facility if needs be. I would liaise with astronomers through various organisations, be it the Royal Greenwich Observatory, be it the British Fireball Survey, or what have you. If we had a photograph or a video, again, there were certain sections that I'm sure you'll be familiar with who analyse and enhance images, again, for the department. So that's the way that it would work, that I would, as it were, coordinate the investigation and run it. And I would bring in these the scientific, the technical experience when I needed it. I mean, of course, the famous one, of course, is the Defence Intelligence Staff, DI-55, who would help me with a range of scientific and technical intelligence aspects of the UFO phenomenon. So it wasn't, arguably, people always debate about, well, was this a very big project or was it a one-man band? I was certainly the only person who had UFOs on my job description. No, that's probably not right. Probably one of my colleagues in DI-55 did too. But as it were, we packed a bigger punch than you might think because of the fact that I could task these various individuals and these various facilities. So that perhaps gives you an idea, a little insight into the setup and the methodology. Because we don't often get into that in interviews.
You mentioned experts. There's been a lot of talk from the United States in the last 10 years about remote viewing projects, Project Stargate or Looking Glass, stuff like that. What on the British side is involved with that? Or do you have any? Did that come in your brief to deal with anything which would be involving extrasensory perception projects like that?
Remote viewing, psychic spying, whatever you want to call it, wasn't in my job description, but inevitably you can't run a UFO project and not find that everything weird and wonderful comes your way. So now...
In that, you'd be able to maybe call on a remote viewer to determine whether a given UFO was in fact real or other.
No. What happened was that on my tour of duty I had a number of people contact me claiming to be remote viewers and offering their services to Her Majesty's government. I mean, they effectively said, I would like to become a psychic spy for Her Majesty's government to help you locate ballistic missile submarines, arms caches, terrorists, drug all those sorts of things that the American projects such as Stargate and Grill Flame and the such like, all the things they gotten into. Now, I discussed this again with the Defence Intelligence staff, and I said...
That wasn't met with a great deal of...
Oh no, it was. It was. Their view, like mine, was, look, if it doesn't work, we haven't really lost anything. Just a little bit of our time. But if it works, we've got a huge potential resource. So of course we tried it. And what we did, I would
Were there any special projects set up to deal with that?
No, what I did is I devised a test that had anyone passed it, I would have then invited them in for a meeting, and we would have taken it from there. The test was very simple. It was simply a test of their ability to do this. And I said, fine, you claim that you are able to remote view. I said, I will give you a time and a location. The time was 8 o'clock at night. The location was the top of my television set, which was switched off. And I said, I'm going to place an object on the top of that TV set. I would like you to remote view, please, and to contact me the following morning and tell me what the object was. Now, I used to say to these people, I used to be very clear, tell me if you think I am, there's something about the test that's going to invalidate the results, or tell me now if you think you're going to be able to do it. Oh, no, they said, yeah, we'll be able to do this. So I would duly place an object on my television, and I'll say now, because I'll change it if I'm ever doing it again, but I would always pick something bizarre and abstract, because of course inevitably people would think, well, it's going to be some little China ceramic ornament or a mug or something like that, or a watch, and inevitably I would select something like a bag of flour or a pillow or something totally inappropriate and very unlikely to guess by chance, and sadly no one ever guessed it. So I wasn't able to put any psychic spies to work for HMG, but I probably would have done if anyone had demonstrated a capacity, and then, yes, of course, we could have used those remote viewers on the UFO phenomenon.
Do you get any other members of the public or maybe of the services who would volunteer their services or have volunteered their services to do investigative services for you on a sort of a freelance basis?
Yeah, I'm contacted, I mean, both when I was running the UFO project and now after I've left the ministry, I'm contacted all the time by people who ask if I need any help with investigations. I'm contacted by people who've had sightings of their own, by people who want to help and become maybe one of my research assistants. I'm not short of offers.
Does one have a relationship with the various UFO research groups in the UK? Yes,
both a relationship which I instigated and cultivated at the MOD, and it's of course a matter of public record that organisations such as Bufora and Quest International and Contact International did have links with me, and we exchanged information where we could, within the bounds, of course, of witness confidentiality. And now, yes, I continue my contacts, particularly with Bufora. Indeed, as a result of my recent television documentary on Channel 5, a number of about 25 new witnesses have come forward, either claiming to have seen the large triangular-shaped craft that was seen back in March 1993 on the night in question, or at another time, either before or since. And now all those cases, of course, we're not just going to let them be forgotten. All those people will be offered Bufora's contact details, and I've spoken to the people there, and they've agreed to undertake those investigations. But I have links with other researchers. I stay in touch, and I'm good friends with people like Timothy Good, Georgina Bruni, Malcolm Robinson. So there are lots of linkages. Yes.
In the same way that in the astronomy, the science of astronomy, you have the professional side does rely, well, to a degree on amateurs.
Oh, absolutely. And if you look at, say, it's a very good analogy. If you look at, say, discovery of comets, a lot of it is actually done by amateur astronomers.
So getting down to the nitty-gritty, there have been a number of cases where large triangular vehicles of some description have resulted in fatalities and aircraft shoot-downs in this country. Notably, one of the recent incidents would have been the Sheffield incident that Max Burns investigated quite a while ago. He's alleging that a NATO jet actually was lost due to an encounter with a triangle. Are there other cases like that you can talk about?
Well, I'm always a little sceptical of cases about aircraft having been brought down by UFOs. I mean, I'll keep an open mind, but one of my previous jobs, the Ministry of Defence, was actually to do with aircraft crashes. So, in fact, I know a little bit about the processes.
You're talking about military aircraft?
I'm talking, yes, of course, yes. I worked, say, with the Inspectorate of Flight Safety, which is an RAF division. And there are certain processes, and I obviously can't go into the details about this, but there's certain processes that come into play when an aircraft goes down. And certainly the so-called Sheffield incident, these processes weren't followed. I mean, some basic things which I can...
way?
Well, some basic things which I can comment on. For example, the protocol, if aircrew survive a crash, is that you would stay at the crash site, because that's where the search and rescue op is going to be centred, and you would immediately toggle your PLB, your personal location beacon. Now, a lot of the testimony, a lot of the things that have been written about the Sheffield incident doesn't quite ring true to me in terms of those actions on. Well, the idea that the surviving pilot would be wandering down the road.
By a bus,
yeah, exactly. Now, I suppose you could have a counter-argument. You could say, well, perhaps he was in such deep shock that his training went out of the window, but it's just so deeply ingrained. It would almost be a basic instinct for any downed flyer just to stay at the crash site and await rescue.
Could it be that maybe what he encountered was so traumatic for him that that's...
Well, as I say, I suppose you could postulate that he was in such deep shock that he forgot absolutely everything in the training manual. I think it's unlikely, but of course it's not impossible.
So you're essentially dismissing that when an aircraft came down then?
I'm saying, from what I have understood about this, I think it's highly unlikely.
Right. There was another case involving a jet, I think Tony Dodd talked about it, where the pilot went missing because it was involved an encounter with some kind of UFO. Can you comment on that?
Yes, that was the case of Captain Schaffner. Now, you'll have to forgive me, I forget the date of the incident. I think it was 1970, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Was it 70? But
whatever.
Yes, when I was contacted about Tony by Tony Dodd about this case, of course, I was familiar from having done this previous job with the Inspectorate of Flight Safety. I was familiar with the procedures. I knew that there would be a case file on the accident. So of course I ordered that case file up from the archives and I had it sent to me. Now I went through that case file, which was probably about that thick, several hundred documents, which is typical for a fatal aircraft accident. I went through those hundreds of documents, page by page, line by line, word by word. I checked for signs that any documents had been removed, any documents had been altered. I found no hint that there was any UFO angle to this. Now, I've written about this quite extensively. I wrote an article for UFO magazine a while ago. But much more importantly, I actually worked with the BBC on this, because the BBC made a documentary, and the pilot's sons had actually come over and were seeking. They'd heard about these bizarre UFO stories. They didn't know what to think, but in any event, they wanted to find out what happened to their father. So I was able to again liaise with the Royal Air Force, liaise with the MOD press office, and of course I was still in the Ministry of Defence at the time, and indeed I took part in this documentary, and I was able to provide the case file to the pilot's sons, and there was no indication of any UFO incident. There was every indication that what had actually happened is this was an exercise at night to practice the interception of a larger, more slowly moving aircraft. So
like Hercules or something.
We actually, for the purposes of the exercise, I believe it was an RAF Shackleton. Of course, what it was actually practicing for was something like a Russian Bear.
Yeah.
Where actually it's a very difficult skill in flying to actually intercept a slower moving aircraft with a fast aircraft. It's a particular skill.
You just overshoot it, and
you overshoot it, and then you have to reacquire your target.
Right, yeah.
Yes, so it's a difficult piece of flying at the best of times. At night, it's even more difficult. And also the Met conditions on the night in concern. Sea was, I think, quite smooth, and it's a well-known cause of many fatalities. For whatever reason, it becomes difficult to actually spot where the horizon is, and the pilot becomes disorientated and simply flies into the sea. An absolute tragedy, but not a hint of a UFO incident. Now, Tony Dodd made, I think, a big thing of the fact that the canopy was closed,
and the pilot wasn't there.
And the pilot wasn't there. But again, the case file made it quite clear that the pilot had either ejected or attempted to eject, or bail out, or what have you, and simply the water pressure then closed the canopy again. It was as simple as that. I'm a little bit angry about this, because it does seem that from no evidence somebody concocted a UFO story which did two things. Firstly, it wasted a lot of serious research time, including my own. But secondly, and far more importantly, of course, it was extremely distressing for his sons and his family. I'm irritated.
Are UFO stories brought in to cover maybe other activities? Because if you blame a given event on a UFO story, well, you can't really investigate it, and aliens don't exist, and well, as we say, they're of no defence significance, so we don't care. Is the UFO tag put on things which otherwise would be maybe have a high level of classification?
The CIA were happy for certainly the UFO cover to be put on various projects, be they SR-71, be they stealth, what have you. We didn't really subscribe to that view. I mean, our view actually is that it's a nice idea, but it actually, if you think about it, doesn't work, because certainly now in sort of multimedia society, the idea of using a UFO story as a cover to make people go away and just think it's stuff and nonsense. Well, actually, the
red
media
flag-
and
red flags were bull.
well, exactly. The media are extremely interested in this, and it's far more likely that people will pay attention to this incident. So no, I was never part of using the UFO umbrella, as it were, to cover black projects.
There was the disturbing case of the helicopter flying from Northern Ireland, which crashed in, I think, the Mull of Kintyre in Scotland. It's been suggested, I think Graham Birdsall suggested that perhaps there was some other cause for that accident, which conveniently took out all the intelligence officers and high-level people in civil and military on one crash. Were you involved with any connection with that crash?
I was not involved at all, and I'm afraid that's not an area that I'm really
Okay.
willing to go into or comment on.
Obviously we have our own triangular craft and things, tests and stuff like that. My experience in Northern Ireland is that certain researchers were pre-warned there'd be certain tests going on, so that if you did see big triangular aircraft, it wasn't a UFO and just to ignore it. Is that kind of cooperation leaked to certain researchers, so that if there's a particular exercise in an area, okay, it's secret. I mean, we've all got to have our secrets and fly our toys.
No, I would never have leaked any information about black projects to any ufologists.
Insofar as
Even in
to cut a case.
whether it be information or whether it be disinformation, that simply isn't the way that I operated. But yes, of course, we've got our prototype aircraft and UAVs.
and they have to fly them somewhere.
We know where we fly them.
And if you get a series of reports of something there, then you can just quietly...
Well, of course, as I say, I mean, this isn't an area where I'm going to go into detail for obvious reasons,
Obviously,
but if you'll forgive the soundbite, I've used it before, but we know where we fly our own kit.
It's a big step going from we've got UFOs but we don't know what they are, well maybe they're just weather balloons, to actually, walking over the Rubicon and actually saying this is something which is not ours and it's something we don't have any knowledge of.
Yes, let's perhaps for that drill down into the detail of the 1993 sighting. UFOs are tracked on radar all the time.
Yeah.
I think
but they don't always lock out your computer equipment and cause it.
But there's an issue. There's a separate issue there. In fact, the problem, if it is a problem, isn't with the radar. It's with the operators, because of course there's a classic story which I tell when I was speaking to someone at Fylingdales, and they said we track fireballs on our radars all the time. We see them go across the screen at speeds of 17, 18, 19, 20,000 miles an hour. It's incredible. And I said, well, that's very interesting. I said, but how do you know they're fireballs? And he said, well, because they go very fast. What else could it be? It's that mindset. You see, that's the mindset that's the problem. You'd actually have to rewrite the training manuals. And I did some work to try and address that issue. But again, I mean, some radar systems, for example, use filter programs to filter out
Get rid of the data.
Objects which are either too fast or too slow. Typically air traffic control radars and things.
They just want to concentrate.
They just want to concentrate on the aircraft. The consequence of this, of course, is very interesting. The consequence is that anything that doesn't, generally speaking, behave like an aircraft won't be picked up, either because the filter program will filter it out altogether, or because the operator, even if it's in, will filter it out with the critical faculties.
So you could have a UFO tracking a civil airliner and the UFO wouldn't come up on civilian radar.
Absolutely.
But would it come up on military radar?
Again,
can you say that?
radar, I'm not going to get into any discussions about the capabilities of radar in terms of ranges, sensitivity or anything.
Course,
You'll understand that. So I'll only, if you'll forgive me, make that general point about
I mean, we have
radar.
the Mexican case where they had many UFOs which were not visible in the visible spectrum but were visible in the infrared spectrum,
Yes.
but they're not necessarily also on radar.
Radar is a useful tool for the UFO project. Some UFOs some visual sightings are correlated with radar data, but then some UFOs that we're pretty sure are big and solid and structured craft aren't necessarily detected on radar. So it's not the sort of it's not the universal panacea, as it were. It's
and
just
of course we can't discuss whether a stealth aircraft is stealthy or the level of stealthiness.
You can discuss it all you like, but I can't.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
On a completely different track, some evidence has been surfacing in the last years about underground facilities in this country involving civilians and some kind of genetic engineering, the creation of strange creatures. Some researchers have suggested that the abductions which are happening are actually done by the military using some kind of genetically engineered being. Do you have any data on that?
I'm very suspicious of this so-called MyLab theory. To me, not only is that totally illegal and unethical, it to me goes against everything that the British government and the British military believe in and stand for.
There have been suggestions there are bases in Wales doing that under US control and bases in Berkshire.
I've seen no evidence that would bear out any of that, and I'm very sceptical. I mean, yes, of course, there are a lot of stories.
It's the creation of aliens. I mean, the Ray Santilli alien fiasco, which has raised its head again, implied it had real data, real film of real ETs. Is there anything which in our country has been dealing with that? I mean,
not in the UK.
Timothy Good's books about underground bases, I thought was strange in that there were bases all over the world except in this country.
Well, I mean,
which I thought was a bit strange.
Yeah,
everybody else has got them except us.
Of course, I mean, the phrase "underground bases" is just so emotive in this field. Let me see if I can't recast that a little. Of course, there will be underground facilities, and of course, at many military establishments, there will be areas that are underground, simply because that's good military sense. I mean, many of our bases date back to the time when of course we were being bombed, be it by Zeppelin or German bombers or whatever, and the threat thereof, whether it was Germans, Soviets or whoever. So of course it's good military sense that you protect your assets by storing them underground. But there's a world of difference between going from that very legitimate fact that of course we have underground facilities and storage areas and such like, and areas at bases, to saying there are some sort of city where people are carrying out experiments on ET and some sort of bioweapons military abduction scenario. I mean, to me these are just stories and fanciful.
The British military wouldn't be involved with it. Is there any way of, or would you have any description within the files of any kind of sort of, shall we say, freelance industrial activity? One of the things I'm referring to is when Eisenhower passed out of office, he did specifically warn us to be aware of the industrial military complex. Is there any telltale signs in this country that maybe they're out of control and therefore compromising our defence as such?
No, I don't think so. I mean, of course, there are a number of big defence contractors that do all sorts of work for the Ministry of Defence, but I'm not going to get, not least for libel reasons, I'm not going to get into any sort of discussion about specific companies or criticisms. But I don't agree with the central premise that somehow in the UK these companies are running out of control, and I mean, of course, their agenda is to make money.
Yeah. No defence significance. You're in the MOD or we're in the MOD. In Britain, our UFO monthly magazine is run with police officers. That seems to sort of imply that there's an official level by some mechanism or other to tell the general public about UFOs. Can you extrapolate perhaps a few years when maybe the equivalent of Tony Blair is going to stand up in the House of Commons and actually admit and say that we do have UFOs?
I think this is going to be events-led. Clearly we are seeing an ongoing programme of disclosure by the Ministry of Defence, both on its website and at the National Archives in Kew. We see, for example, the release of Project Condign, the Condign Report, 464 pages, formerly secret UK eyes only classification. A few years ago, unheard of that material like that would be disclosed.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point. I mean, there's going to be...
And more to come.
Yeah,
More to come.
eventually there's going to come a time when somebody's actually going to have to say, yes, we do have...
Well, I think there'll be a critical mass.
Yeah. Do you think we're anywhere near that?
Whether there's a smoking gun or not, I'm not gonna. I'm not really gonna comment. What I will say is this:
How high is the dam?
Well, let me put it this way: in depending on how the project goes, 2014, the next generation radio telescope will begin to come online. I think it will take a number of years after that for it to be fully functional. I think that's about 2020. Scientific opinion is that although its primary purpose is not SETI, but scientific opinion is that if within 100 light years of Earth there is another civilization, this next generation, the radio telescope will be powerful enough to detect the radio signals that should be the signature of an industrial society. And I think I believe that one should perhaps focus on that as a potential trigger point, because it will be then, I think, that if they're out there in our little corner of this one galaxy, we will actually have the scientific proof. And I do feel, sad to say, with greatest respect to ufologists, that proof of the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations will not come from ufology. It will come from mainstream science. Now, of course, between now and 2014, we should be seeking to position ufology as mainstream science, or as near to it as possible. I'm playing a part in that myself. I speak regularly at science conferences. I've spoken at the Cheltenham Festival of Science, Newcastle Science Festival. I've debated the UFO issue at the Science Museum's Dana Centre. I'm both openly and behind the scenes forging some links there and trying. I think there should be bridge building between ufology and mainstream science.
There's a lot of scientists themselves would be very keen to find out what the evidence is in ufology.
Yes, because they could
win.
But
they don't want to get involved because reputations are at stake.
Well, they should. Someone could win the Nobel Prize off this if they are just courageous enough to actually look at the data. So someone's going to win it.
What about portal technology? Scientific data, if we get out of our three dimensions, okay, telescopes are wonderful because if we stay within our three dimensions, you need a telescope to see something very far away. But if we deal with the principle of non-locality, which is a buzzword, I think, the kind of events which are going on at Bentwaters and Woodbridge to this day implies that there's some kind of portal technology going on. Researchers are seeing beings coming out of doors or sort of portals or doorways. They're being invited into those doorways. Since this is happening right beside a currently active UK military base, surely there is a defence significance in that.
Well, of course, I make no secret of saying that I've always felt that the UFO issue raises serious defence and national security issues, and I most certainly don't agree that UFOs are of no defence significance. I mean, how could it not be of defence significance?
The implication being that if they're of no defence significance and they're acknowledged to be there, it would imply that somehow we are in bed with these ETs in some description.
No, I think the no defence significance soundbite, and it's an MOD soundbite, of course, not mine, is just a very quick and easy way of saying we don't know, we don't think that anything that we've seen thus far constitutes proof, though admittedly it may constitute evidence.
But if we're losing aircraft
If, well, that's a big if.
If we're losing aircraft, surely it is a defence significance, but we just don't want to admit it. But we can't come up with an answer.
Well, one could look at cases like Captain Mantell, and one could say clearly there was an aircraft that was lost chasing a UFO. That's a matter of public record. Whether that UFO was an extraterrestrial, intertemporal, interdimensional craft or not, of course, is not known. So I'm not necessarily agreeing with the idea that we've lost aircraft as a result of hostile, intelligently controlled UFOs. But going back to your point about portals and things, yes, it's very interesting, of course, that at the end of 2007, CERN's Large Hadron Collider, the largest ever machine built by humanity, will be switched on, and there are many researchers, scientists, who believe that that will actually show us some of the hidden dimensions. So I think the idea that you'll be able to collide particles and create such energy that rather than decaying, you would actually see these particles simply disappear into one of the hidden dimensions is hugely exciting, and it means that some of the theories around portals, whatever you like to say, will I think as we approach the run-up to the turning on of the LHC, we will see that this subject becomes more respectable and more mainstream, and I think that's a good thing, because of course all sorts of things that we label, all of these funny labels, ghosts, spirits, portals, we may find that there's good science behind it, and when they turn on the LHC, we may actually begin to understand some of that science.
Finally, you've mentioned, apart from the 2 or 3 cases that you've specified, you mentioned on one of the programs which you've been doing over the years that I think the phrase you use, you really do want to see these cases. Are there any other cases which actually are to mind that you can discuss, which actually deal with UFOs?
There are some cases which I would say on reflection are probably as good, as significant as the Rendlesham Forest incident, as the overflight of RAF Cosford and RAF Shawbury in '93, as the case from Belgium in 1991 when F-16 fighters were scrambled to intercept a UFO that was being tracked on radar. There are cases of that level. Unfortunately, all I can really do is give people... Now, I'm working with a lot of researchers.
I mean, you said that you really do want to see these cases.
Yeah.
So
what I can't do is, as it were, forestall the MOD on this. When the MOD decides, either proactively under the publication scheme or reactively in response to an FOI request, the time is right to release those cases, then that's when we'll know about them. What I can't do now is sit here and prejudge, because don't forget, as I was saying, every single case file has to be examined to see whether any of the exemptions under the Freedom of Information Act apply in terms of say, national security, defence, international relations, data protection concerns. Yeah. I can't, so I'm not going to talk about these cases before the MOD releases them. That would get me into trouble.
It's been said in the papers that...
But I am, sorry, but just to finish that point, yes, I am working with a number of researchers and organisations, helping them with advice about how to word their FOI requests.
Not use the term UFO for a start.
Well, exactly.
What terms should one use?
Well, to be fair, UFO will probably work, but you could use UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. That's the
undersea objects as well.
You can use those terms. Try and cover all the bases. What I would say is that you want to word any FOI request in a targeted fashion. I mean, it can't be a catch-all. Please send me all your UFO files. That simply won't work. it should be targeted and focused, but not so narrow that you miss out on other interesting things that you might come across by serendipity.
So one is implying that there's a lot of data just sitting there waiting to be given to the public if, in other words, the ministry isn't going to sort of
No.
give it. But if
No.
you have to ask the right question,
Yeah.
then certain cases would become...
Yes, I mean, don't forget, it's a massive job. The MOD, since 1950, has received about 10,000 or more UFO requests. Now, some case files for the more detailed investigations will be well over 100 pages long, so there's a vast amount of information, and it's a massive job to go through all that and to check it, as the MOD must do, page by page, line by line, word by word, to make sure that there's nothing there that shouldn't be released. So it is a huge job, but the MOD, despite what some conspiracy theorists say, it is hugely committed to FOI and open government, and there are many people in government and the military who are interested in and believe in the UFO phenomenon and want nothing more, as I want, to see all the files released.
I mean, you've said in the papers that we're wide open to alien attack. I think that it was one of the headlines was something like that.
That was a soundbite.
Was that a criticism that because your department and what you were doing is essentially finished, that what are you saying, that the ministry should actually have a department, have a successor to yourself?
Yes. I think I was slightly misquoted in some of the newspapers.
Well, I've never heard of that before.
Well, absolutely. I wasn't saying we are about to be invaded by aliens. What I was saying was that the UFO phenomenon does, to my mind, raise defence and national security issues. How can it not, when these things are seen by trained observers, they're tracked on radar, sometimes they land. So, given that, my only point was they should be the subject of proper scientific study and investigation. I don't see how anyone can argue with that. And yes, my point was, and this was, I think, the point that was somewhat lost, it's one of those bizarre quirks of fate that because the MOD has so many requests under the Freedom of Information Act, I mean, it's the number one subject that people write to the MOD about. It's not Iraq, not Afghanistan, not what did my granddad do in the Second World War. The number one subject people contact the MOD under the Act about is UFOs. So there's a vast amount of work in dealing with all this. Because of that, the people now running the UFO project are spending they've turned into an FOI cell. Indeed, if you look them up in the MOD directory, the section is now renamed Directorate of Air Staff -FOI. It's not investigating and researching the UFO phenomenon. So all those investigative outputs that were there in the 90s when I was running the project are now gone. And I was saying that's where we're missing a trick. What this is even if you're a skeptic, it's low probability, high consequence. You might convince yourself that just like the threat to the Earth from, say, a planet killer asteroid, you might convince yourself, and you'll be statistically very correct, that the chances in your lifetime of a planet killer size asteroid or comet ploughing into the Earth are very, very small. Yeah, that's correct. But if it does happen, the consequence is effectively the end of the world. The UFO issue is exactly the same. Low probability, high consequence. The high consequence could range from, if you believe some science fiction films, an almost Independence Day type scenario, that the high consequence actually could also be missing out on the opportunity to acquire and back engineer technology that
it's implied is already happening.
Yeah. Let's face it, the nation on Earth that actually acquires extraterrestrial technology and is able to then adapt it and use it is going to be the dominant nation on planet Earth for the next 10,000 years. These are high stakes.
So in essence, maybe one should be concentrating on the Department of Trade and Industry for Freedom and Information Act. Maybe where do they get their new gizmos from? Did they get it from extraterrestrial re-engineered craft?
Well, you can try, but I wouldn't hold up much hope for that.
There have been cases in Portugal, Venezuela, United States, South Africa, where UFOs have been fired on by military jets. Are there any cases like that in Britain? They've gone
Not
weapons
in
hot?
recent years. We've certainly, of course, fired on them with gun cameras, but I'd better not answer that question.
I think it's almost time to go. And many thanks indeed. Nick, have you got any final words that you'd like to sort of say? Anything you really want said? Any particular thing that's bugging you?
Well, I do wish that I think it's no secret that I'm demonised by some people in ufology who
As
accuse
everybody
me.
in ufology is.
Yes,
if you
but-
don't work for the
But I
CIA,
think,
any other person does.
well, I think that I'm always, even now I've left the MOD, I'm going to have this government tag.
Are you really secretly still working for the MOD?
I mean, I hear this all the time that I must be the friendly face put out here to peddle disinformation and to prepare the general public for the definitive announcement. I mean, it's not true. I'm not a man in black. I'm not a disinformation agent, and I do wish that people would sometimes not have this knee-jerk reaction that because I work or worked for the government, that somehow I must be evil and I must be lying and everything must be disinformation. I mean, please judge me on the data, not the sort of prejudice. That's what I would say to the world of ufology.
During your time, did you ever meet any ETs in the military? Have you got your special advisors?
If I did, I wasn't aware at the time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.